Why hello there, and welcome to Doctor Who and the role-playing game reviewing weirdo on the internet. This one's a Swerorg and a Doctor Who review. The Doctor Who role-playing game was released in 1985 by FASA and, as you may expect, is based on long-running science fiction television series, The Doctor Who. So grab your recorder, pin on your celery, and let's get into it. Players in the Doctor Who role-playing game take on the role of human companions or apprentice Time Lords who are part of the Celestial Intervention Agency. CIA, I think it's supposed to be a joke. A group of renegade Time Lords who have chosen to violate Time Lord law by intervening to protect humanity, Earth, the universe, etc. Basically, it's a way to work out a sort of, Doctor Who style game without having to have Doctor Who in it. So let's make us a character. The first step is to choose a race. The only options provided are human and Gallifreyan, and there is no difference between the two, so let's just go Time Lord. Then we roll 2d6 and add the results to 36 to get our attribute point fund, which is then spent on the 6 attribute scores, which are then used to determine the character's attribute performance levels. Next, we roll to determine a special ability, derive some derived stats, and then it is on to skills, which are determined by spending skill points equal to the total number of attributes, but then gets a little more complicated, as each skill point spent from a specific attribute to buy a skill tied to that attribute counts as a number of points equal to the attribute's performance level. So, for example, our character has a charisma score of 21, which is performance level 6. So, charisma gives us 21 points to spend on skills, or 126 points to spend on charisma-based skills. Now, this may sound a little bit complicated, and it is, but fortunately we have spreadsheets these days, and that makes it much easier. Then all that's left is to roll up a personality trait, general appearance, age, and number of regenerations used, and this character is done. So, yeah, that was obviously a wee bit complicated. Like, all of the things you have to do have their purpose, but it kinda makes you question if that's the best way to do it, or just a way to do it. And a lesser complaint is the fact that humans and Time Lords have the same statistics. That's not really in keeping with the show, which has shown that Time Lords have vastly superior strength and endurance. I do somewhat like conceptually the idea going on here with the party structure, where you have one player being an apprentice Time Lord and the other players being their companions. It kinda seems like it would have an interesting dynamic in the actual, structure of the players, because one person is a little more in charge, and it's interesting in Doctor Who. It could be interesting, in a Doctor Who role-playing game. And also, the wide selection of skills and abilities and stuff is nice, and the effect of having the points from the attributes being spent on related skills, making them more valuable, like, the function of it I like. I like the function of it, that it kind of encourages you to choose your skills to complement your attributes, rather than choosing skills to compensate for your attributes. So a 3 out of 5 for character creation. It gets the job done, but it is a bit of a job to get it done. However, character creation should ideally be the most complicated part of the game, because you build your character, then your character is done and ready to play the game, and you don't have to mess with it anymore. I'm obviously leading into something, so let's just move on to the next section. The mechanics in this game are certainly a thing, so let's just go ahead and cut away to the illustration. Alright, so let's say that the Arbiter is trying to convince Ambassador Drestendulum that the Space Squid Empire plans to invade his homeworld of Trovixtet 7. Since the outcome here is uncertain, we pull out the Interaction Matrix. The Arbiter will be using her negotiation/diplomacy skill. However, and I am not making this up, since we are dealing with an ambassador, we must recalculate our skill proficiency level based on the average of the skill rating and our charisma score, which bumps the proficiency down from mastery to expert, and sets the ability entry line at 6. The GM decides that this task is of professional difficulty, and sets the task entry line at 5, but also adjusts it for -2 for the ambassador's well-known stubbornness, and another -3 because this conflicts with what he believes to be true based on the peace talks he is currently engaged in with the space squids. So we cross-reference the ability and task entry lines to find that the target is 6. The dice are rolled and the result is 5, and since the result is equal to or lesser than the target, the attempt is a success, but just barely. Combat is a whole other thing entirely, and I don't particularly want to get into it. But here are the basics. Characters have a number of action points per round to spend on their various actions. Attacks are made just like any other checks, with the interaction matrix and the ability and task entry lines being set by the specific attack being made, and then modified by just a whole bunch of things. And that is about as much into it as I care to go. Okay, so that was what it was, and overall, the interaction matrix isn't that complicated. Occasionally, the issue is just using it every time you need to make a check seems a little cumbersome, especially in something like grid-based combat, which is already slow and cumbersome. And another issue is, as shown, sometimes you just need to recalculate one of your skills to make a check, which is inconvenient to say the least, but there's lots of these little conditional things for the skills, so you kind of have to memorize every single conditional use of a skill that requires you to recalculate it, or just look up every skill every time you use it. So a 2 out of 5 for mechanics. It is a bit overcomplicated, just like character creation. The difference here is that, well, for one thing, you need to actually recalculate stuff you did in character creation in order to use the mechanics, but also just, you have to use them all the time. Them being complicated is more of a burden on the game. So this book has a lot of content, lots of information on playing the game and running the game and time travel and just like all the important times and places and peoples of the Doctor Who universe, the Master, the Daleks, the Cybermen, the Silurians. It does go into a lot of stuff that the show doesn't cover as much because it is a role-playing game, so they did need to like fill in a lot of the gaps. So by modern standards, some of the stuff's outdated, but it's good that they put the stuff in there. There are also sections for randomly generating worlds and societies and alien life forms. There's also, of course, statistics provided for the Doctor and like 15 out of 27 of the companions at the time, depending on who you do and do not consider to be a companion. Also a good amount of monsters and equipment and stuff like that, although, as I often do, I have to question the things they chose to focus on. Just for example, let's compare the entry for Sonic Screwdriver with the entry for Jelly Babies. One of those things might be slightly more important to the game than the other. So a 3 out of 3 for content. It pretty much gives you everything you're going to need for like a mid-80s or earlier Doctor Who adventure. Okay, so I have something of an issue with the way this book is written. It is boring. Very boring. It repeats itself constantly, and things are written in what just seems like the most unnecessarily long and complicated way possible. It's like they are actively trying to make everything seem as technical and complex as possible, instead of just trying to explain things in a way that they're easy to understand. However, my biggest complaint here is something that I normally like when it's done well, but in this particular case it is done poorly. The game is presented in several booklets, one of which is a player's guide and one of which is a game master's guide. And the general idea here, or the way it should be, is that you give all of the information that the players need in the player's guide, just the information to create and play their characters, and then you expand upon those in the Game Master Guide. And that is what they were trying to do? The issue is that the player's guide does not give you the necessary information you need to make your character. Just for example, the wrestling skill in the player's guide states that it may increase your grappling skill. Doesn't say how, just that it may. Who knows? In the Game Master Guide, it is explained that 1/3 of your skill rating in wrestling can be added to your skill rating in grappling when determining your proficiency level in grappling, and that is a thing that you might need to know if you were, say, making a character. But it's not in the player guide, and that is not like an isolated incident. There are lots of skills and abilities and things that are just described so nebulously in the player's guide that they're basically useless, and you have to go look them up in the Game Master's Guide. And that kind of defeats the point of having the player guide, because if you need to look in the Game Master's Guide anyway, you might as well only have that. So a 1 out of 3 for writing. It is long and kind of boring and overwritten, but somehow still manages to not provide necessary information in the places that it should be. The Doctor Who role-playing game was released in a box set featuring the 4th Doctor and Leela on the cover, who hadn't actually been on the show since 1981 and 1978 respectively. The box contains a player's manual, a game operations manual, a sourcebook for field agents, and some dice. The overall layout is okay. It's some very dense text in a 3-column design, although it does have its own distinctive aesthetic. There are lots of illustrations, as well as screen caps and promotional photos from the show, which do a good job to, illustrate stuff. So, 3 out of 5 for presentation. It is okay overall, but nothing special. And there we have it, the Doctor Who role-playing game. A Doctor Who role-playing game. One that does the Doctor Who part pretty good, but the role-playing game part, not as much. It is definitely on the crunchier side of things, and if that's what you're into, you might like this game. I personally do not, but as I often say, I don't have to like it for you to like it. Alright, thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure to hit all the lovely buttons, and if there are any games that you think I need to take a look at, or specifically if you would like to see me cover the recent Doctor Who role-playing game, let me know in the comments, and I will take those things into consideration when I am planning out future content. Well, until next time.